Good evening. My name is Rabbi Amy Bardak. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, and along with my colleague Marlene Layton, I would like to welcome you to this commemorative Torah study session. Marlene is going to be in charge of tech issues. If you have any issues, please do a private chat to her, Marlene Layton. And before we get going, I want to acknowledge that we have live breaking election news coming likely during this hour or next hour. And at the request of the victims' families, we are keeping tonight's Torah study apolitical and nonpartisan. We are sympathetic that you may want to share news, but we ask that you, if you need to, that you chat one-on-one privately to another individual and not to everyone on the call if you wish to discuss the election. But we do hope you're here to honor the deceased and to learn Torah. Please do not post to everyone about the election. Today we honor the lives lost and the people affected by the attack on three congregations, Dor Hadash, New Light, and Tree of Life, or La Simcha, on October 27th, 2018, the 18th of Cheshvan, 5779. Our Torah study today is dedicated in memory of the 11 people who perished on this day 2 years ago. Please rise if you are able as we recite their names. Joyce Feinberg, Idit Baltacha, Bat Abba Menachem Bechinka. Richard Gottfried, Yosef Ben Chaim. Rose Mallinger, Razel Bat Avraham. Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda Ben Yechezkel Veselma. Cecil Rosenthal, Cecil Chaim Ben Eliezer. David Rosenthal, David Ben Eliezer. Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel Bat Moshe. Sylvan Simon, Zalman Shachna Ben Menachem Mendel. Daniel Stein, Daniel Avraham Ben Baruch. Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol Ben Yosef. And Irving Younger, Yitzchak Chaim Ben Menachem. Zichronam Livracha, may their memories be a blessing. You may be seated. I am so pleased to introduce our scholar for this session, Rabbi Gordon Tucker. I knew Rabbi Tucker during my rabbinical training at the Jewish Theological Seminary, when I had the privilege also of serving as a rabbinic intern at his congregation, Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York. And Gordon also officiated at my wedding. Rabbi Gordon Tucker, PhD, is Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is the Senior Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York, and a Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartzman Institute. Rabbi Tucker was ordained at JTS in 1975 after receiving an undergraduate degree at Harvard College and a PhD in philosophy from Princeton. He is the author of scores of articles in Jewish theology and law, and published Heavenly Torah, a translation of and commentary on Abraham Joshua Heschel's 3-volume work on rabbinic theology. A leading scholar and interpreter of conservative Judaism, Rabbi Tucker's most recent publication is a commentary on Pirkei Avot, part of the Rabbinical Assembly's Lev Shalem liturgical series. Welcome, Rabbi Tucker.
Thank you, Amy. It's a humbling and somber experience to be part of a commemoration of violent loss, together with the community for which I am quite certain it is still vivid and inducing of intense emotions and questions. I know that there are family of victims with us tonight, as well as survivors. But all of us are here to witness and to be present in solidarity with the three holy congregations. And indeed, with the entire Jewish community of Greater Pittsburgh. We will have a recitation of Kaddish Rabbanan at the end of our hour. And in the meantime, now with reverence, we dedicate this period of study to the memory of the slain. My focus this evening is going to be on the theological aspect of witnessing, and certainly experiencing such traumas, because sometimes we find ourselves forced to certain thoughts and hypotheses, and sometimes to abandon certain thoughts and hypotheses. We're forced to do that by ways in which undeniable experience exposes the sheer inadequacy of the conventional answers. We know that theological questions arising from events of widespread suffering have long been raised in our tradition and in other traditions as well. One might wonder if there is, in fact, still something left to suggest, such that not only will our theological understanding be enriched by it, but perhaps we may be guided to truer and maybe more compassionate reactions to our experiences. My shorthand for the main conventional theology and theology about suffering, the fancy word for that, which I may use again, is theodicy. It's about the justifying God in the wake of suffering, what seems to be unjustified suffering. My convention for this, the main conventional theology, is the equation between doing good and doing well. It says that you will do well in the sense of prospering if and only if you do good in the sense of acting properly. So consider what the Torah represents to us repeatedly, though not exclusively. Plagues, for example, are reflexively connected to sin and punishment. And that's not surprising if you think about the most well-known passage that equates doing good with doing well. It's in Deuteronomy, Dvarim, chapter 11, and it happens to be the centerpiece of the twice daily Shema. Here I'm going to begin a little bit of screen sharing with some texts that will help us to navigate our session tonight. Is everyone seeing this? Yes? Amy, perhaps you can tell me is it being seen?
Yes, it's visible, yes.
Good, okay. So you see this first one is listed as doing well equals doing good. And here's the relevant verses from the Shema. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God, serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. Take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and bow to them, for the Lord's anger will flare up against you, and God will shut up the skies so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning to you. So you do well if and only if you do good. They are essentially equivalent. And now a fateful question kind of begs itself to be asked by each one of us for ourselves. And the question is, consider the God of Deuteronomy chapter 11, the God who metes out suffering as punishment for sin, the God who ensures that if you are not doing well, if some tragedy has befallen you, the only possible reason is that you haven't done good. Good people don't suffer. Only scoundrels do. And then ask yourself honestly, can I really be at peace worshiping that God? Now, in order to make more vivid the challenges of this second paragraph of the Shema, I'm going to turn us briefly to a work of fiction. It's Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Bridge of St. Louis Rey. Now, in this very rich and touching story, the offense that the traditional theology of suffering we are talking about, the offense that it gives to experience is tackled quite directly. And here's how. There's a very sympathetic but ultimately misguided character in the novel. His name is Brother Juniper. He witnesses the catastrophic collapse of a bridge in Peru, which caused 5 people to fall to their deaths in the deep gorge below. And Juniper, who is motivated by a need to justify the tragedy, so he decides to devote himself to investigate everything about those 5 in order to clarify why they were brought together by God at that bridge at that very moment, and why what happened to them was in keeping with a moral economy. And it emerges in the book that Juniper already had some practice in this, because years earlier, a plague, an epidemic, had struck his own village. And he had labored at that time to discover what was the moral algorithm that would explain why some peasants succumbed to the virus and others survived. So let's go back to our screen share here, and we'll pick it up at that point. I'm calling this not doing well equals doing good, or does it? It was by dint of hearing a great many sneers at faith that Brother Juniper became convinced that the world's time had come for proof, tabulated proof of the conviction that was so bright and exciting within him, that God is always just. When the pestilence visited his dear village of Puerto and carried off a large number of peasants, he secretly drew up a diagram of the characteristics of 15 victims and 15 survivors. Each soul was rated upon a basis of 10 as regard its goodness, its diligence in religious observance, and its importance to its family group. And here's a fragment of this ambitious chart. So 5 people, this is a fragment of it: goodness, piety, usefulness. The thing was more difficult than he had foreseen. From all this saddening data, Brother Juniper contrived an index for each peasant. He added up the total for victims, and he compared it with the total for survivors to discover that, the emphasis here is mine, the dead were 5 times more worth saving. It almost looked as though the pestilence had been directed against the really valuable people in the village of Puerto. And on that afternoon, Brother Juniper took a walk along the edge of the Pacific. He tore up his findings and cast them into the waves. He gazed off an hour upon the great clouds of pearl that hang forever upon the horizon of that sea, and extracted from their beauty a resignation that he did not permit his reason to examine. And here's the real punch line: the discrepancy between faith and the facts is greater than is generally assumed. So with that, Wilder has essentially driven a stake through the heart of this conventional theology. Yes, it is fiction, but it is fiction that, as we all know, and it hardly needs to be rehearsed here in this gathering, we all know that that conventional theology simply doesn't answer to experience. So let's turn to a text now in the Jewish canon, to the book of Job. We have been given an enormous gift in Edward Greenstein's new edition of the book. 15 years earlier, he had already anticipated some of what is in this volume when he wrote an introduction to the book of Job for the Jewish Study Bible published by the Jewish Publication Society. You remember the story of Job. We don't go into all the details, but there aren't even that many details. Job suffers all sorts of horrible losses and tragedies, all of his children, all of his wealth, his bodily health. It is there is no apparent reason for it, except that the reader knows it was something like a dollar bet between God and Satan. And then he has 3 friends, true friends, but very misguided friends, who for 30 some odd chapters talk with him, debate with him about what the meaning of this was. And they are the spokespeople for the conventional theology. Job, you are mostly a righteous person, but you must have done some terrible things because this wouldn't be happening to you otherwise. And Job steadfastly insists, I know the truth about myself and you don't. And then for 4 chapters, God speaks a famous speech out of the whirlwind, out of the storm, and says everything about God's power, says everything that could be said about God, with the notable exception of answering any of Job's questions and demands for justice. So what does Greenstein tell us in this introduction to Job? So he starts by noting that everyone who opens the book of Job and is looking for the theology of suffering ends up in the end being very, very frustrated. So here we go back. Edward Greenstein from the Jewish Study Bible. There's no resolution to the problem of evil in Job because that's not the theme of the book. That's an eyebrow raiser. Yeah, the problem of innocent suffering, the search for an explanation for a case like that of Job, that's the topic of discussion among the participants in the dialogues. Yeah, the characters are talking about that, but it's not the theme of Job, the book. Instead, a prevalent theme in Job is that of honesty in talking about God. Job takes pride in his absolute commitment to speaking only truth. And there is a radical turning point in the book, and it comes at near its conclusion. God turns to Job's companions and reproves them for not speaking truthfully about him as Job, my servant, had done. Now just stop there for a second. You would normally expect that God would be approving of Job's companions because they are trying over and over again to convince Job that God is just. But the turning point in the book is when God directs his anger not at Job, but at the friends. Job may not have arrived at the truth, but he had reason to believe in what he was saying as it came to him honestly, unlike the words of the companions, who merely repeated uncritically the wisdom they had received. As we would put it, perhaps, they learned the Shema in Cheder, and they just repeated it to Job. Seen this way, the book of Job promotes honesty in theological discourse and rejects a blind reliance on tradition. Now, note the ire, the anger that facile theodicies provoke in God. God says to the friends, to Job, he says, I'm incensed at your friends. Because it seems that even God is startled and offended by the image of God's self that is painted by this traditional second paragraph of the Shema theology that's being peddled by Job's friends. God looks in the mirror, or the mirror that's held up to him by Job's friends, and doesn't like what God sees. So what could be an alternative? So I'm going to suggest that we notice how much of what crushes us in our human travails results not only from moral rage, the kind of horrendous crime that was visited on this community, it's certainly that, but also by the apparent randomness of such painful events. Why random mutations of microbes and chance encounters between different species half a world away arise to erase more than 1 million lives worldwide? Why does the Gulf Coast get hurricane after hurricane? And although anti-Semitic and racist rage and murderous rage is not random, that just these 3 congregations become the target and a few others randomly around the country and the world, that does seem to be random. So now that I've introduced that idea, I turn now from the biblical, we'll come back to Job, we're going to turn for the moment to the Talmudic. And we're turning there for 2 texts that incorporate not only a recognition of randomness in God's world, but an actual embrace of it as a foundational truth about the world. So let's now look at these 2 Talmudic texts with that idea of randomness in mind. Back to our screen share. So here we are. Can there be randomness in a world created by God? From the Talmud, Brachot 7:8. Whoop. My computer just slipped off, sorry. Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, Moses requested 3 things from the Blessed Holy One, and all were granted to him. He requested that the divine presence rest upon Israel. God granted it. Moses requested that the divine presence not rest upon the nations of the world, little mean-spirited, but God granted that to him. And lastly, here's the real point. Moses requested that the ways in which God conducts the world be revealed to him, and God granted it to him. As we'll see, the ways in which God conducts the world is a kind of a code for why there seems to be innocent suffering. So Moses said before God, Master of the universe, why is it that some righteous people, some righteous prosper and some righteous suffer? Some wicked prosper, some wicked suffer. There seems to be no rhyme or reason. And God said to him, no, there's a rhyme or reason here. The righteous person who prospers is a completely righteous person. The righteous person who suffers is one who's not completely righteous. That's what Job's friends were trying to peddle. And conversely, the wicked person who prospers is one who's not completely wicked person. He's done some nice things. And the wicked person who suffers is a completely wicked person. This is what Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi. And now look at what the Talmud goes on to say. But all of this is in contradistinction to Rabbi Meir's opinion, who lived almost a century before Rabbi Yochanan. For Rabbi Meir said, no, you got it wrong. 2 of Moses' requests were granted to him, but 1 was not granted to him. God did grant him the divine presence would rest on Israel and that it would not rest on the nations of the world, but God did not reveal to Moses the ways in which God conducts the world, as it is said, and now quotes from the book of Exodus, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, that is, even though he's not worthy, and I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy, that is, even though he is not worthy. So notice the struggle. Let me take the screen share off here. Notice the struggle here to articulate what Moses was allegedly taught by God. But it ends in a kind of contradiction and ultimately vagueness of what it means to be not completely righteous. What kind of metric is that? But Rabbi Meir, who, by the way, in another Talmudic story, suffered an inexplicable tragedy when his 2 young boys both died on the same Shabbat. Rabbi Meir comes forward as human morality. Like it or not, you will not change it.
Gordon, you froze. Rabbi Tucker, you froze for a half a minute.
No, and it said
Repeat.
my internet was unstable. I don't know what that means because I've got full bars here and I'm right in the middle of my house. So
very strange, but we'll hope for the best. Just go back a sentence or 2.
It's one of those blips, right? Rabbi Meir says no to the idea that Moses could have been taught anything about this because it's a world in which God cannot be constrained by human needs or human morality. You like it or not, you're not going to change it. God's will may be the determinant, but there's no decision procedure by which we can possibly predict what will befall the world and its inhabitants, because that has nothing to do with our needs or our merits. That's Rabbi Meir. And this then brings us to the second text, the most radical of the 2, because the way in which it admits randomness in a way that you will now see. From a different tractate, Chagiga. Rav Yosef reached this verse in the book of Proverbs and he cried. The verse was, there are those who are swept away without justice. It's a verse in the book of Proverbs. And he said, is there one who goes before his time and dies for no reason? So the Gemara answers, yes. I'll give you an incident. I'll tell you a story of Rav Bivai bar Abaye. He was frequently in the company of the angel of death. There are great rabbinic stories about people who meet Elijah all the time. I'd rather meet Elijah than the angel of death, frankly, but this Rabbi would have tete-a-tetes with the angel of death. And the angel of death, he saw tell his agent, instructed his agent, go and bring me Miriam, the raiser of women's hair. He went, but instead brought him Miriam, the raiser of babies, different Miriam. The angel of death said to him, I told you to bring Miriam, the raiser of women's hair. His agent said to him, well, if so, sorry, my bad. Let me return her life. Let me bring her back. And the angel of death, said to him, nah, since you've already brought her here, let her be counted toward the number of deceased people. But how were you able to kill her? The angel asks the agent. The agent responded, well, that he had the opportunity because she was holding a shovel in her hand, and with it she was lighting and sweeping the oven, and she took the fire and set it on her foot. She was scalded, her luck suffered, which gave me the opportunity, and I brought her. Some freak random accident happened and gave me my window to get her. And now comes the punchline. Rabbi bar Abaye then said to the angel of death, do you have permission to act in this manner? Meaning, doesn't God supervise you? And the angel of death said to him, isn't it written, but there are those swept away without justice? Meaning, the clear meaning of this text is, don't expect that there is that kind of divine supervision over this. The angel of death strikes where the angel of death strikes. And that's part of the way of the world. It's about randomness built into the world, entirely independent of God's will. And thus, we now come to the real targeted question for this session. How can we, it's very nice to give up a conventional traditional theology, but you need something to replace it with. How can we refashion a world of faith and a world of moral action, given the randomness in our life experiences, for both good and bad, by the way? In all my years in the rabbinate, lots of people came to me with the question of, why did this undeserved bad thing happen to me? I don't remember ever getting a single question from anyone about why this undeserved good thing happened to me. But it does happen too. How do we refashion a world of faith given the randomness that is constantly staring us in the face? Now, I want to make an obvious point, but it's obvious, but I want to make it explicit. I am taking it for granted, given where we are at in this exploration, that the idea of an active personal God, that is, one who is cognizant of, one who is concerned about God's creatures and whose power that we speak of is the kind of power that we're familiar with in our own human interactions with the world, that idea of God is not likely to survive for many of us. It will survive for some of us, and that's fine. But we have to face the fact it's not going to survive in our world. It didn't survive in the ancient world either for many people. Certainly not for those who have experienced the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So we need to look elsewhere for a theology that might begin to answer our needs. And I am very cognizant of the fact that no theology is ever going to ring totally true and work for everyone. But even if my suggestion, which we're now getting to, prove troubling perhaps from a religious or emotional point of view, I trust that they will get a passing grade from at least an ethical point of view. So there may be no conscious master plan that explains Job's agonies. So what do we do and think now? Well, so what finally transpired with the character Job? When all the dialogue and the argument was over, after God had thundered about the divine might for 4 chapters, but never addressed Job's real demand for justice? Well, let's look first at the beginning of the final chapter of the book, chapter 42. Just leaving out the first verse, which is not relevant to us. And I'm going to give it to you now in 2 different translations, and you'll see why. One is the translation of what is known as the Revised Standard Version. It's a standard Christian, modern Christian version of the, I have this propped on a slippery thing, I'm very sorry about that, of the entire Christian Bible, including what they call the Old Testament, and the translation from Edward Greenstein that I have already mentioned that just came out last year. So look at this. I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted. This is Job speaking. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. I want you to notice two things here. First, the quotation marks at the beginning of verse 3 and verse 4. Why are they in quotations? Because Job is actually throwing back at God God's words in that famous speech out of the whirlwind from a few chapters back. And the way in which this translation reads, in other words, Job is saying, you asked me this, I've got an answer for you. But the way in which this translation reads is how the vast majority of translations until quite recently have rendered these verses. And it is sometimes referred to as Job's recantation based on how verse 6 is translated. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. It's as if Job is apologizing for all that he has strenuously maintained from chapter 3 to chapter 31. But why would he recant? Because of that majestic speech out of the whirlwind? Yeah, poetic grandeur. But it utterly failed to address Job's pain and Job's complaint. So let's go on, skipping Greenstein for a moment, to what Jack Miles had to say. This was an ambitious work called God, a Biography. An ambitious work detailing the biography of God as it is presented in the Hebrew Tanakh. And it's because of this passage from Miles that the Revised Standard Version needed to be brought here because he directly refers to it. Look what he says. We come now to the cryptic closing verse of Job's speech in the RSV, Revised Standard Version translation. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. This is the filament from which hangs the thread, from which hangs the entire traditional reading of Job's last words as a recantation, as an apology, as retracting everything that he had said. It all hangs on this last verse, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. If the first 4 verses in the speech have been translated to read as a recantation, it's because they have all been interpreted in the light of this closing verse. In the Hebrew, however, this verse is ambiguous. And in this resolution, in this translation, no word has less support from the original than the word myself, because the Hebrew here is emas and not emasti. It doesn't have the first person pronoun at all. It's just invented in this translation. So against the traditional interpretations, he says, it is likely that though Job is in the grip of profoundly changed and negative feelings about something at this point, that something is not himself. He has some changed and negative feelings, and it is picked up by Ed Greenstein's translation of that last verse. That is why I am fed up. Notice the first person pronoun is not there. It's not fed up about myself. That is why I am fed up, and I take pity on dust and ashes. What is dust and ashes? Humanity. That's what Abraham said. I am mere dust and ashes. I take pity on humanity. I take pity for the fact that we are all going to experience, in one way or another, different levels of intensity. No one is going to be untouched by random suffering. And that is something to be pitied. So far from a penitential recanting, in this rendering, which is much more consistent with everything that we have seen about Job in the previous 39 chapters, Job here is recognizing the capricious and often meaningless, really meaningless randomness that has crushed him. And he resigns in deep disappointment. But the book doesn't end there. Along comes an epilogue in which God says something that is wholly unexpected. You already had a foreshadowing of that when we looked at Greenstein's introduction to the book, but now we'll see it really here. Because here it is in this new Greenstein translation. And I'm calling this Compassion as Practical Theology. It happened, now YHWH, that's Yud He Vav He, so we'll just say God. It happened after God spoke these words to Job, that God said to Eliphaz the Temanite, the oldest of his three friends, I am angry at you and your two companions, for you did not speak about me in honesty, as did my servant Job. That's what we already saw earlier tonight in Greenstein's introduction. But let's continue with the biblical verses here. Now then, God says to Eliphaz, take yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering on your own behalf. You're the sinners. And my servant Job will pray for you. For I will lift up his face without doing anything unseemly to you. If he prays to me, I'll listen. For you did not speak about me in honesty, as did my servant Job. So they went, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. They did as God had spoken to them. And God did indeed lifted up Job's face, means he paid attention to him. For God had restored Job's restoration when he had prayed for his companions. God added double to what Job had had. Okay, so what has happened here at the end of this book? It's often read as a kind of happy ending story, but of course it isn't. It couldn't be. Maybe God thinks Job has been restored, but Job cannot ever be restored. He can, however, be changed. Psychologist Carl Jung noted the fact that as he puts it, Job speaks right and God speaks might. They're speaking on different planes because they're radically different. One's a human and one isn't. His insight, Jung's insight, was that the non sequitur character of the whirlwind speech only makes sense. Why would God completely talk besides the point? It only makes sense if God is in fact utterly incapable of understanding Job's demand for justice, which means that despite what the very beginning of the Torah, Genesis 1, told us, we're actually not exactly made in the image of God because we are radically unlike. We know what suffering and injustice is because we are subject to it. God cannot know that. You ever been at a shiva when someone comes in and says, with all good intentions, I know how you feel. And you know that the mourner always wants to say, no, you don't. God at least has the seichel not to say, I know how you feel, because God doesn't. God isn't human. God can't know that. And the truth teller, that's Job, has now corrected this comforting idea, but it's an incorrect idea, that God knows all that we know and more. There are things we know that God doesn't, and it has to do with suffering. The usual understanding is that Job has now been reduced to silence. He repents in dust and ashes. I have nothing more to say. You've cowed me into silence. But in God's recognizing that Job is making an argument that only a finite human being can make, and that the infinite, timeless God cannot really understand, it's actually God who is reduced to silence. And let's just go back for a moment to this screen. Another thing that Jack Miles says, a view common to nearly all commentators on the book of Job is that one way or another, the Lord has reduced Job to virtual silence. Unnoticed is the fact that from the end of the book of Job to the end of the entire Tanakh, God never speaks again. And that's true. Those last words, you haven't spoken as honestly about me as my servant Job has, the last things God ever says in the Hebrew Bible. I wondered when I first picked up Miles's book years ago, he's a Jesuit. Why is he writing about the Tanakh? You know, the Tanakh, the 24 books of the Tanakh are not ordered in the same way that the Christian Bible is. In the Christian Bible, the Old Testament ends with all the prophecies and right through Malachi. But he was interested in doing a biography of God as it appears in the Tanakh. And in the Tanakh, that's the last thing God ever says. God has nothing more to say after this encounter with Job. So what does happen to Job in the end? So apparently, he is now, as opposed to just a few verses earlier, he's no longer resigned in disgust to the inevitable blows that the world by random chance inflicts on all without any moral discrimination. He faces not a personal, active, capricious God, certainly not a malevolent God. He faces a God for whom the moral truth that matters so much to Job is not really recognized in the way that humans recognize it, because God is so utterly different. God is the timeless, eternal realm of the eternal moral principles, not of the local moral dispensations. So what does Job do? After God's admission that Job has a truth that escapes even God, he's no longer wallowing in perpetual disappointment and cynicism. He forgives his friends, and he had plenty to forgive them for. And he makes offerings for them. He prays for them. And while he is smart enough for us to know that he never entirely gave up mourning his losses, he was able to come to terms with life and even enjoy what it brought him in his many later years. For that's how the book ends. Not with Job saying, I am fed up. It's not where it ends, but rather with having achieved a fullness of days when he died at the age of 140. It seems that a theological revelation that is so jarring to the traditional mind has somehow created a sober and very humane equanimity on Job. He was sorely injured, but he wasn't chastened and certainly not defeated. And that's what's left for us in this examination of randomness and justice, to look at the ways in which our own unique human gifts, the gifts of moral sense and compassion, can bring us meaning, even as we are forced to give up on the sincere but misguided quest for a theodicy. The gifts of moral sense and compassion that we can take from life as we understand it and see it and speak of it honestly. There are two Finnish philosophers. Because they're Finnish, I won't even try to pronounce their names. They considered this in a very compelling way, and it's the last thing I'm going to put up this evening. Maybe you can try to pronounce these names. But in the journal Philosophy and Literature a few years ago, they wrote a very interesting article, but it's only this one passage I want you to see in talking about Job. You notice Job's sincerity, just the honesty that Greenstein was talking about. The falsity of the friends' views, the friends of Job, also stems from their intellectual efforts to construct tenable narratives in order to explain Job's turmoil. And thus their mistake has a moral basis. By the way, there are Talmudic passages that say, you're entitled to hold whatever theology you want, but you're not entitled to inflict it on other people when they're in the throes of suffering. Especially after the Second World War, critics have emphasized that narrative means can be ethically problematic in trying to make sense of individual suffering. Instead of building explanations and appealing to fictive causation, false causation, what should they do? They should aim to relieve misery by helping the victims. Because that, I would say, in a very Jewish vein, that's truly God's work. And what I want to just end with is to continue Jack Miles' train of thought, thinking about the sequence of books in the Tanakh. Isn't it fascinating that when we turn the page in the Tanakh, after completing the very heavy book of Job, the book that leaves us frustrated because we don't ever really get an answer to random suffering, we turn the page, the very next page brings us to the next book of the Tanakh. Do you know what it is? It's the Song of Songs. And the pleasure that the plenitude of God's world brings to us. And the capacity for compassion that the awesome power of creation as the unfolding of God's power has given us. And maybe that's why when Thornton Wilder needed a way to end the novel that we excerpted earlier tonight, when he needed some final words with which to end that novel, this is how he ended it. There is a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the bridge is love, the only survival, the only meaning. So I thank you for your attention. I see 10 things in the chat. Somebody's monitoring this, right? So
Yes, I think if we can just take a minute, I'll summarize some of the questions that came up, which are,
very good.
did God learn anything from this in the end? Did God regret the telling Satan to bring harm to?
So that's this is where scholarship can be useful. I studied this book. It wasn't the first time I ever read it, but the first time I studied it in depth was with the late, great Bible scholar, Professor H.L. Ginsburg. And he spoke about JP, Job the patient, and JIP, Job the impatient. And the narrative frame, remember, chapters 3 through 41 are all like poetry. It's Job and his friends going back and forth in these poetic dialogues. But there's a narrative story in chapters 1 and 2 and at the very end that's about Job being hit with all of these things and saying, the Lord hath given, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. He has this infinite patience. And H.L. Ginsburg and many other scholars said, look, one of the things you have to understand about this book is that it seems to be a kind of an amalgam of two different things, a folk tale about a guy named Job who suffers and accepts it, and God rewards him. And then there's a whole other book of Job the impatient, who is protesting his innocence and trying to sue God in the court of morality. And that's the whole enormous middle of the book. But of course, the truth is that the book has not come down to us as Job the patient and Job the impatient. It's come down to us as Job. Someone redacted this together, and that someone had something in mind in putting that in here. So I can't give you a firm answer to God learn anything about this bet, but one can imagine that in the face of Job's honesty, the kind of recklessness that God is portrayed as in the opening chapter of making this bet with Satan, which, by the way, is the basis of the movie Trading Places, where it really was a dollar bet that got Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy switched, and all sorts of Jobian things coming upon Dan Aykroyd. It's a comedy, so we understand you're not to compare what happened to Dan Aykroyd to what happened to Job. That God may feel defeated in a way. But that's the beauty of literature, including biblical literature. It leaves it up to us to imagine what a deity who is talking, which is in itself interesting, right? What is the deity thinking? But the fact that there is silence, I think, is one of the most profound things. That insight from Jack Miles that we never hear from God again for the rest of the Tanakh, I think, is truly telling.
I want to thank you, Rabbi Tucker, for your words of Torah and for everyone who participated tonight. We are going to conclude with Kaddish Rabbanan, and I invite Audrey Glickman to recite it. Marlene put the link into the chat. We're not going to be sharing the screen. Audrey, rather, was reciting Kaddish Rabbanan when the attack began, and she couldn't complete it then. And we're so grateful that tonight she can complete it with us in memory of those we lost. Please rise.
If I may, just before that, I want to give warm blessings to everyone here. And I hope that the entire commemoration and being together has had a soothing effect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Please rise and join as you're able. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah v'alma divra hirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kariv v'yemru amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevorach v'olam v'olameo maya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yit hadar v'yit aleh v'yit halal Shemei dekudisha barichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechemata, da'am iran v'alma v'yemru amen. Al Yisrael, v'al Rabbanan, v'al Talmidehon, v'al kol Talmidehon, v'al kol mandiaskin v'oraita, di v'atrahadein v'di v'cho atar v'atar, yehe lahonu lachon shloma rabbah, chino v'hista v'rachamin, V'chayin arichin u'mazona revicha u'for kana min kodam avahon divi shemaya v'yamru amen. Yehi shalom rabba min shemaya. V'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav hu barachamav ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Thank you to Audrey. And if you're interested in joining Rabbi Jonathan Birkin's session, it's on this very Zoom link. You can just stay on and mute yourself, and that will be starting at 8:30. If you registered or would like to attend Rabbi Deborah Waxman's session, that is another Zoom link that you should have received. Good evening, everyone.